Steve, did you know that supposedly Hitler, he only had one of them? Goering had two, but they were very small. Himmler's were rather similar, but poor old Goebbels, he had none at all.
And Hitler has only got one ball. The other is in the Albert Hall. Yes, that'll be it.
That's the music from, I think, is it the River Kwai March? Didn't they use it in the Bridge over the River Kwai?
Bridge over the River Kwai, I do believe you're right.
Someone's listening and hasn't got a clue what we're talking about.
That doesn't matter, Mark. Most people listening haven't got a clue what we're talking about. In fact, you and I mostly don't have a clue what we're talking about as well, so we're in good company.
Yeah, that's true. Okay. Well, Hitler, what can we talk about him?
There's lots that we can say about him, isn't there? Lots of interesting things about him and lots of intriguing characteristic. And why did people follow him? Why?
Yeah.
Mark, why?
That is something I think is really important because it's appropriate right now. There's been a definite swing to the right, and there is the risk, I'm not talking about the States, but worldwide, that we're certainly Austria has voted right wing again for the first time in since the war, isn't it?
It's always a worry when Austria go right, isn't it? When you're talking about Hitler.
It is. Yeah.
It's always a little bit of a worry, I must admit. I'm pretty laid back about most things, but when Austria go right, I do turn my mind back to there being that gentleman back in the early 20th century there. I think, interesting.
Yeah. Interesting character. I mean, do you want to talk about him, his potted history?
Well, I think it's just worth understanding that he didn't just appear out of nowhere.
No.
And like with everybody who becomes a mass murdering something or other, there's always a pathway that leads them to it somewhere along the line. So, what do you know about his early life, Mark?
Well, he was born in, I think he lived near Linz in Austria, if I'm correct. He was a choir boy. And he said many years later, when he was made to be like a church boy and a choir boy, he remembers looking up at the wall at a carved pillar with the swastika, because it was the file flot. It was a medieval symbol. And, of course, it goes much further than that because it's a Hindu sign
it does.
Used to this day. And that's actually in Sanskrit, it's swastika. So his father was supposedly brutal, a customs union man, I think. He had issues about growing up. He basically ran away into Vienna. He tried to make a living out of art. He failed, probably somewhere along the line. He may have been turned down by a Jew.
Have you seen any of his artwork?
Yeah, now, funnily enough, I don't think they're that bad. They're not great, but they're not like... Yeah. I mean, he had some kind of ability to block and set a picture, but it's just the refinement. He tried to get into the elite art school, but was turned down, possibly by a Jew.
So we're seeing a couple of quite formative things going on here already, then, aren't we? He's been brought up in a home where potentially his father was quite a strict disciplinarian, and so he would not necessarily have been grown up in a nurturing, loving type of environment. And then when
typical of the era.
Oh yeah, very typical. But then depending on what sort of character you are, depends on how you receive that type of treatment. He then leaves that environment and he goes to take up this desire to be an artist, of which he's not good enough. So I could almost imagine him being told, "You're not good enough at home." Beat, beat, beat. He leaves home. Now he's been told in the world, "You're not good enough in the world." Now we're starting to get some building blocks of his character, right? And we're starting to get some shape forming around him. This is a man who's not good enough. And
it was also a product of where he lived. He grew up in the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Yeah.
And he was from the part that was predominantly German culture, but of course a lot of it was not. It was Slavic. And that was bad enough as far as he was concerned. But it was also a layer of people that he said later, and he may have been over-embellishing, as soon as he saw them, he wanted to throw up, and that was the Orthodox Jews. He said there was nothing like them. And when he found out that a lot of them controlled a lot of fiscal power, that really got to him. So he was little Weasley man with a big chip on his shoulder, and he didn't like where he lived.
Interesting. And of course, we then see Germany enter this disastrous First World War, the Great War.
Yeah, absolutely.
And he's a soldier there, isn't he? And he goes into the war. He fights on behalf of Germany. He gets temporarily blinded, if I understand this right. And he had some pretty raw experiences during his war service, which then builds on to this boy who wasn't ever good enough, and now he's serving a country that's defeated. It's another almost nail in the coffin of his character, isn't it?
And many Germans, because the interesting thing is that he was brave, Hitler. He won the Iron Cross second class and first class during the war. That was quite rare. This is not a guy with bone spurs. He literally, although he tended to be a runner, a messenger, he was gassed. And when he was been at the front for a long time, he happened to go to, if I remember, Pasewalk, which was the hospital, where he was told that there's potentially going to be an armistice, and he couldn't believe it. He was shocked. And like many German soldiers, then and after the war, they couldn't get over the defeatist sense that Germany had behind the lines.
Yeah.
So the army was convinced, and absolutely correct, they never lost a battle, and they never lost one on German soil. In their mind, they would have been victorious. They'd done an Operation Michael. It was going to be the big last push. Never happened. They surrendered. Well, not surrendered. They did the armistice.
Yeah.
And afterwards, he didn't quite get that Germany was starving. They'd gone through what was known as the turnip winter of 1917, 1918. And in the German Empire, turnips were only ever given to horses. The fact that they had to have turnips, that was a real, literally, kick to the psyche. And he believed, he couldn't get over how defeatist the Germans were, the civilians, and he was a typical soldier. How do you go into a world-class army, which was the best potentially in Europe? It just couldn't fight on two fronts, or three actually. And then they believed, well, it wasn't the army then. And this is key. This is key to fascism later. It wasn't the army. We were stabbed in the back. You know, the Dolchstoßlegende, I think that's the correct word in German. The legend of being stabbed in the back. And of course it's...
The backstabbing myth.
Yeah, it's BS. But a lot of soldiers weren't going to say it was our fault. And especially one who's as decorated as he was at such a low level. So yeah, he was absolutely psychologically buffeted, and he is going to be like a lot of people at that point.
I know that as we sort of track through his career right up to the very end, 1945, he gave his Führerbefehl, which was demolitions on Reich territory, also known to history as the Nero Befehl or the Nero Order. And he said, he said, if the German people lost its faith, if the German people were no longer inclined to give itself body and soul in order to survive, then the German people would have nothing to do but disappear. And so in the spring of 1945, he gave orders for the destruction of Germany. He'd become Teutonophobe, who wanted to destroy Germany because it had failed to live up to his expectations for it. And this, I think, is coming from the character that was shaped from a youngster who failed to meet the expectations himself. And so therefore it's like transference.
Very good, yeah, very
across
good.
Everything.
Yeah.
And that's probably what I see with this dude. I mean, I was reading a really interesting piece on it. It's a really, really good book, actually. It's by Andrew Roberts, and it's called Leadership in War, and it's lessons from those who made history. And it picks up on a number of people, and Hitler is one of these guys. And Roberts makes some really I'd like us to, when we wrap this up, I'd like to close with something that Robert says here. But he talks about Hitler, and he says he was a completely mediocre individual.
Mm-hmm.
Just because he was like the central figure of the first part of the 20th century, he was just a total mediocre individual, physically unprepossessing, a relatively high IQ, but a mind that worked on extremely narrow tram lines, incapable of normal one-on-one human interaction on the basis of equality, uncomfortable in anything approaching debate or discussion, a terrible know-it-all, bore, and conspiracy theorist. Absolutely no sense of humour, very little travelled. Even in Europe, even when he dominated Europe, Adolf Hitler was a nullity as a human being.
Yeah.
He was also, he puts in brackets, which I quite like, he was also a vegetarian, teetotal, non-smoker. Maybe one or possibly two of those afflictions might be acceptable, but he had all three. And I thought to myself, so that really does paint quite a rich portrait of this individual, understanding a little bit about his background, understanding about his failures, understanding he never even achieved, understand his mindset and the transference of that mindset. Yeah, interesting man.
He was very similar to Napoleon. Both came from low ranks, and you mentioned I always know it as the Gotterdammerung period. It was like he loved Wagner, and he would often go to Beirut where Wagner had been, and he spoke to his wife, and he was obsessed with Wagnerian legend and like Tristan and Isolde and all that, and the music and Siegfried's funeral. Da, 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 da. You know, the music they had in Excalibur.
Yeah.
And it says a lot about that when he thought that, because he saw himself as being married to Germany at the end. And then when they betrayed him, when Germany betrayed him, he was prepared to immolate the one he was supposed to be married to, till death us do part. And that is just typical, almost runic in the past, the Germanic kind of mythology of the past, of this prince who would literally burn himself rather than give in. It's just an amazing, sad fact. And of course, we know that with the SS and the SS runic things, they had this false belief in that they were repeating history from the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages of myth.
Yeah.
By then, he completely lost the plot. He probably had Parkinson's and he wasn't clearly thinking. But more importantly, and this is what I would like to talk more about, is the enabling thing about him. Is at the end, you know that famous meme about when he's taken the thing about Steiner, and it like, you know, someone loses something and they'll put the English words as though he's speaking about somebody in the modern world.
That's right. Yes, yes.
He was looking at a map and he believed that all of the units were full of men, but they weren't. They were just ghosts units. He'd completely lost it, but they kept lying to him.
Well, that's right, because nobody spoke the truth to him.
No one dared.
Nobody spoke truth to power. So you couldn't talk to him about what was really going on, because he would totally lose the flipping plot. So everybody, and you saw this sort of thing, and you see this sort of thing with every dictator. No one speaks the truth to power in any form of dictatorship. You look at Saddam Hussein over in more recent years. Nobody spoke the truth to him, and if they did, they ended up in a very sticky mess at the end of it. So you couldn't do that, and so therefore the man was always going to be driven not by the reality of what was going on in the world, but by the concepts that he had in his head, and how he would then speak those out almost like as a religious thing. It became like a religious thing, didn't it?
I'm glad you mentioned that, Steve, because the warning. There was a wonderful book actually, Warning from History. The warning about Hitler is that history repeats, and it's starting to.
Oh yeah.
There are definitely signs that people want to be dictators. They're even following the same model. And we got to remember that Hitler was voted in. He wasn't voted into the Chancellor. It was basically a backroom deal. And the idiots who gave over to him thought they could control him. but that, as we now know, was a complete and utter mistake because of what was known as Article 48 of the Weimar Republic, in that there was this made-up fire in the Reichstag. They all had to go to the Kroll Opera House, the government. It was painted as it was subversive communists, actually a Dutchman, who had set fire. It was over-exemplified as being a disaster to the German nation. They wanted revenge. And Hitler said, well, give me powers were under attack from the communists. And they gave it to him. And then that was it. He never gave anything back. And what's amazing, so many dictators come to power because some kind of military threat, in question marks, or war.
Well, that's right. And you look at the world that we're living in at the moment, where everything is a threat, everything is a risk, everything is we are here to protect you. And it's when a government start to constantly want to protect you from a risk, a threat, a disaster, that you then start to see the unraveling and the undermining of the democratic institutions and the principles of which those countries are built upon. And that's exactly what Hitler did, wasn't it? But once he was appointed Chancellor of Germany in January 1933, over the course of the following year, he began to dismantle all of those democratic institutions. He established a one-party state, and he declared himself the Führer, the leader, in 1934. And so, having been put into the position, rightly or wrongly, as the Chancellor, having consolidated his power base around him, having got all of those people who would never say nay to him around him, he was then able to start to push this one-party state and declare himself the Führer. Undermining of democratic institutions on the basis of fears and threats and potential risks. Now, you've only got to look at the Western world and look at fears and threats and potential risks that we are always having flagged up to us. We have got to restrict your freedoms because of this risk. We've got to restrict your freedoms because of that risk. We've got to restrict your freedoms because of this risk. And before you know it, your democratic institution is completely undermined.
Yeah.
And it's when we see those sorts of things happening that we should get the picture of Adolf Hitler flash across our collective memory and go, hang about a minute, we've seen this crap in the past. Well, I know a bloke back in the 20th century who had this MO, this modus operandi, and it didn't go very well. So we want to nip this in the bud. Toot sweet, my old fruit.
He was a playboy. He wasn't necessarily gifted intelligently, but thought he was. He thought he was a genius. He, when he came to power, managed to get toadies around him that would follow everything he said. He had a campaign where he would go around Germany saying, Deutschland erwache, Germany awake. Let us go back to our glorious past. Bring a strong military. Get rid of the people who are threatening us internally and want to come into Germany because they're taking your jobs. And then when he renamed the party into the NSDAP, which in German, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation. I know how it's spelled, but I can't pronounce it. National, that's where Nazi comes from. So the Sozialau Party, the Sozis, well, these were the Nazis. National Sozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei. The National Socialist German Workers' Party. Workers.
Yeah.
And it was effectively saying, don't trust the elites in the cities, and he had to tone that back when he wanted to get money from them. Let's do a cult of the workers out in the districts who are pure at heart, and they do a hard day's work. I sent you a video very similar to that, didn't I, about a modern guy saying this is exactly what's happening out in America now. It's the same language. It's the same tropes. And the question is, how do people fall for it?
How do they fall for it? I think that often there is a environment that is garnered by other political parties that enable that to flourish. And like we have said before, whether you are left or whether you are right, it's not a straight line; it's a circle.
Yeah.
And the whether you become communist or fascist you're touching each other on that circle, mate. You know, I couldn't care less if you're a communist or a fascist. You're much the same. What you're going to be doing is you're going to be a nightmare to live under.
Yeah.
It's trying to find the balance of everything. So while I recognise that there are patterns that you can see and you can see being played out at the moment, that will not necessarily mutate into another Adolf Hitler scenario just because you see some of those patterns played out. Doesn't have to go that way, because what you do is you maintain your checks and balances, you maintain your underpinning democracy. Now, if a Western country were to completely say, actually, there is no longer a democracy, the democratic institutions are not fit for purpose, we are the single source of truth, we are the only ones that you will listen to, that's when you've got to start to flipping worry. Now, we have been in this country. We are the single source of truth. Don't listen to anybody other than us.
That was Ardern, but she's out of power now.
She's now out of power, but that's right, because the democratic institutions have remained in place, so we could vote her out. If we end up with it, let's say, for example, and obviously the analogies that you use play very heavily into what we can see going on in the United States. If you get President Trump next year, the year after, standing up and saying, there is no Republican Party, there is no Democrat, there is just the United States Party, and you are either for us or you are against us, and that is it. Now we've got a problem, right? And now we're starting to see those things morph into something that could be very nefarious indeed. Personally, I don't think that's going to happen. You know, we'll be able to dial this back in a few years' time and we'll be able to analyse that perhaps. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that the democratic principles will prevail. I don't think that they will prevail in every Western nation. But I think that there will be probably more the Anglophile nations that they will prevail. That's my suspicion, that the Anglophile Western nations are going to be less inclined to go down that path. And I might be wrong, but that's just my suspicion. And I've got nothing to base that on. It's just a suspicion. I think that there are other Western nations where they like a dictator. They quite like a good old dictator, whereas the Brits particularly don't.
Okay, I'm going to slightly go off track here. You know the film Wizard of Oz?
Yeah.
Who is the evil one of the witches? It's the Wicked Witch of the East. Very 1930s. It's the East. But is it? Now the good one is Glinda. But think this through. Who dropped a house on the sister of Wicked Witch of the East? It was Glinda. Who stole that witch's? Well, in the book it was silver, but in the film red ruby slippers. It was Glinda. Who gave them to a dupe? Dorothy. But didn't tell her that she could literally do this and always go home until after she'd gone to Oz and got the wizard to leave. So if you had all the enemies of the Glinda, the nice white-looking witch, she got rid of all of them. So who's the evil one? It's Glinda. But what she did, she demonized someone who looked different. Someone who stood for different values. And she used it as a threat that they're trying to take over your country, your land. She is fascist to a T. And it's interesting that no one sees that very much. It's like what fascism is very good at, what the right wing has always been superb at, is defining what the other side are like and then deflecting what they're doing.
Do you not think that that's the same though for the extreme of the left as well?
Absolutely.
I don't think it's unique to
the
fascism.
Left, the extreme left is the right,
Yeah.
but the right generally can do that because here's the signs for fascism. Cult of a leader. The leader is the one in charge. A national restoration. Hatred of immigrants. Hatred of liberals. Hatred of homosexuals. Trans. In this modern world, a dislike of women, and a very great dislike of intellectuals. Which country am I talking about?
You're setting
You
me
don't
up
know,
here.
do you?
You're setting me
No,
up
because
here.
you don't. you can't differentiate. That's the thing.
Well, I couldn't differentiate between that and communism.
True,
Because
but we're talking.
they're all the
Okay,
same.
communism's not the threat here, is it? The threat here is the states. And if you look at Trump, I'm not saying he's going to go fascist. I'm not saying that at all. In fact, I don't think he will. I agree with you. The things that are set up, because it's the states, he can't control everything to do with the state. They have governors. But what will happen, he may try to get rid of the governors and restock the Senate. He's not the problem. It's the ones that are in the shadows.
It will be an interesting thing to watch. I'm honestly not particularly fearful. Maybe I'm just stupid, but I'm not fearful of Trump coming into power. I'm not fearful of people. I'm not fearful of Putin being in power in Russia. I'm not fearful of these things. I've read enough history to know that people come, people go, that nations rise, nations fall, empires ascend, and then they plummet. And we're in this cyclical process. I think that what intrigues me with looking at somebody like Adolf Hitler is that there are certain patterns, as you've identified, that you can start to see played out. And those patterns, those characteristics will get dialed up, they'll get dialed down. And when they're all starting to get dialed up together, when we're starting to see the undermining of a whole range of things, when we're starting to see the democratic institutions undermined, when we're starting to see we are the single source of truth, when you start to see all of these other things come into play, you start to go, yeah, this isn't a good time. And then when you start to say, well, now only if you're of this blood stock do we think that you should be here at all. Now you've got serious problems, and you get all of those characteristics all dialed up, all of
Might be too late.
and you're in for a nightmare. So I think that the beauty of understanding the past and understanding historical figures of the past is what gave rise to them, and what can we then do to ensure that people like that don't get the traction that they need to cause that sort of horrendous thing again. I mean, with Hitler, he had incredibly aggressive foreign policies of annexation. He wanted to annex different areas, and so you saw that with Austria, didn't you? You saw that with the invasion of Poland, which obviously. Which led to the outbreak of World War II. Obviously, he wanted the Lebensraum, the Great German Empire. He wanted to push all of that out across into Europe, and that his belief in the racial superiority of the Aryan race. I mean, as soon as people start to look at another human being, and just based on their background, the way that they look, the colour of their skin, the clothes that they wear, the god that they worship, you start to look at them and go, oh, you're a lesser being than me. You've got a problem anyway, haven't you?
The thing is, though, like we said at the beginning, Hitler could not have done this on his own.
No, he had people around him.
And I've read enough history forums to know that if anyone asks a question, how was it that he came to power and was sustained in power for so long? People have thought this through, and they've put down, general stupidity, greed, Schadenfreude, which is an indifference to other people's suffering. First they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew, etc. Pleasure over others' suffering, that may be Schadenfreude, actually. And Carlo Acutis, whoever he is, I've just found this quote, said, "We're born originals, but many die as photocopies." There's this willingness to become part of the herd, which I've never understood. So I personally, all my life, have wondered, why is it that they did this? I think I've managed to tie together what it could have been, but it may be a bit out there. I don't know if you want to hear it.
Yeah, go on, hear it. Let's hear it.
So when I went to, and you probably would have done this because you've done philosophy and theology and stuff like that, the study of knowledge is epistemology or epistemic. So how do we gain knowledge? Well, a part of that theory is epistemic virtue and epistemic vice. So let's look at the virtue first of all. What are the virtues of learning? Well, open-mindedness. You are willing to look at other people's point of view. you've got curiosity, and you are prepared to start engaging in a narrative that's not necessarily your own worldview. And it's because of that we get the progress in science. We've asked certain questions we may not like the answer for, but we've gone out and done it as a race. And they are considered to be the virtues. What are the vices then? Well, you know about Vice Squad, but think of the epistemic Vice Squad. The vices of learning is closed-mindedness, no curiosity, you're not going to ask questions, and you're certainly not going to stand up to authority, and you will not engage in an alternative narrative that's not your own. Where does that lead to? Gullibility. No one is going to basically say no to somebody who tells you you must do this, you must do this, you must do this. And secondly, indoctrination. If anything about Germany and other parts of the world today, there seems to be a contagion of epistemic vice. People have bought into a narrative that they're not prepared to change. How has that been reinforced? Echo chambers. How is that reinforced? Every day they're hearing the same thing because they listen to one news outlet. It's only ever telling them one point of view. And if anything disturbs me about the American election is how many people said openly they would not vote for Trump, and yet they did.
All the time that you were saying all of that stuff, which I absolutely agree with, and I don't disagree with that at all. All I can see is what has gone on in Western nations over the last 4 years, and Trump wasn't even in power. So we're talking epistemic virtue, openness, curiosity, engagement. Every one of those three areas has been closed down in the COVID area. Every single one of them. You could not ask questions. You could not be curious. You could not engage, because if you did, you would be cancelled.
Oh, Trump was in power when that happened.
No. Trump came in Trump left in 2020.
Yeah, so, but it's 2019. He got criticised for not doing enough, didn't he? And,
I know, but
drinking
I'm talking
bleach.
But he didn't put in place all of these other draconian actions that have come on since 2020. He didn't push any of that. So all of that, cancelling of scientists, closing down a conversation, all the rest of it. Well, that's an epistemic vice. Closing down, no curiosity, none engagement, gullibility, and getting people to be indoctrinated by buying into a narrative which is not been prepared to change. And you look at every single government over the last 4 years, Labour government here, the governments in Australia, the Democratic government in America, all of them have closed down. They have not been curious, they've not engaged, and they are and I think that Trump's election is actually a pushback against what we have just seen about the epistemic vice that you have absolutely perfectly described, which is why I'm not so concerned that Trump, I almost see Trump as being a balancer, funnily enough, to bring something back which has gone so far this way that we now need to get this ship back on an even keel. I don't think that his radical tendencies that he may have had because of his bullish attitude or the way that he speaks, and let's face it, he's very difficult to follow and he's very difficult to engage with. He's not a politician, he's a businessman, and so he's got a very different mindset and a very different way of engaging. But I think that everything that you've described is, and the reason that he's now been brought back into power is because this is a pushback against the epistemic vice that we have seen over the last 4 years from the governments that have been in power, which was not Donald Trump. And what we got with Adolf Hitler is all of that stuff, epistemic vice, in bucket loads, which would marry better with the governments of the last 4 years than the potential one coming in 2025.
There is I almost dread bringing it up, but I think because we're talking about Hitler, I think it has to be. So, trigger warning, and I don't mean this to belittle anybody, and it's about faith. One of the arguments that, and in fact it was Christopher Hitchens, and he kind of, I think, belittled his own argument by the way he talked about it. He always said, oh, the German soldier loved God. They were warriors of God because they had God on our side on the belt. Well, we wore stuff that were given to us. We didn't make them. I don't think that is something he wins the argument with. But it is true that the ones in charge did prayers for Hitler 2 months before he died. And they did it every year. It's a bit similar to the Metropolitan of the Russian Church supporting Putin. Now, you could argue, have they got any other choice? They're in a dictatorial regime. If they don't seem to come out and support the leader, the dear leader, they may not be around for much longer. But I've always wondered, why would some members of the church, and I'm talking churchianity now, I'm not talking Christianity, no Christian, I think, would have supported Hitler. They may have had to be quiet, but the ones who came out, why are they doing that? And I can only surmise one thing, and I'd like to think that I may be wrong. A lot of churchians want to bring about the rapture. They want war and discord because they want to end it all. And in fact, I was taken by some comments on somebody on YouTube who was talking about what could happen next 2025. And quite a few were saying, I want it to end in flames, I want to get off this planet. And I thought, oh, right, is that why they voted for someone like that? Surely not. I thought it was trolling. But there is circumstantial evidence that a lot of Germans wanted the end times or total control, because then they could bring around, under the likes of Hitler, I guess, total annihilation. I don't know if that's correct. It could have been propaganda used by people against Hitler at the time. Certainly when he fell, one of the ways to denazify a country is to scare the bejeebers out of people. Imagine where it's going to go towards the end, and you get books coming out about it, don't you? You know, like The Boys from Brazil, and this need to try and create a superior race even after the war. But I've always wondered, were there people who, for whatever reason, wanted the end times?
I think that in every faith, and even in non-faith, nihilists just want to see everything just end. So whether you are whether you're a nihilist, whether you're an out-and-out sort of anarchist, whether you are a fundamental Muslim who would also want to see the end times and the world burn up and the return of, you know, God's reign and rule in some other bizarre way. And if there are people who are wanting from a Christian perspective, who are wanting the end of times to come because of the rapture, well, first of all, I would say that there's a lot more work that you need to do about the doctrine of the rapture and what that actually is. Secondly, I would say that your job as a Christian is to live and show Christ. And Christ says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, all your strength, and love your neighbour as yourself. Love your neighbour, i.e. the one who is like you, as yourself, which means that you treat them with absolute integrity and with the highest possible ethic, because they are made in the image of God. And so therefore your neighbour is made in the image of God. And so you should treat that image of God with the highest. But
that wasn't followed.
Highest personal ethic.
That was not followed.
But that's what a Christian would do. Now, somebody who wears Christianity as a cultural tag, like Richard Dawkins, says, "I'm a cultural Christian." He says, "I'm a cultural Christian." Well, he's an atheist who doesn't believe in God and who's got nothing good to say about Christianity. But he's a cultural Christian because he was born and raised into a Christian institutional upbringing. But that's not being a Christian at all. Being a Christian is being a Christ follower. And so you look at somebody's life and you say, is this person's life more or less like Christ? Is this person living a life like Christ? And if they are, then you can pretty much stick a pin on it and a little badge on it and go, yeah, that's probably a Christian. But if they're not, then you say, no, they're not. They're just a member of an institution, nothing more than an old boys club. So people who pray for, whether they are in Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, whether they are Egyptian Coptics, whether they are evangelical Protestants in the West praying for weird stuff. You can't rely on that at all. And it's certainly not just within the domain of a person who spouts being Christian. Don't ever believe what somebody tells you. Look at their life and what does it show you? How do they live? How do they live? You know, because that's what it will say. There was something that I said the other week when I was speaking, which was, you may be the only Bible that somebody ever reads. And that's it. So when they see you, do they see Christ or not? because you're probably going to be the only Bible that someone's going to read.
I mean, we talked about this on our other channel, the rise of Christian
Yeah.
nationalism, especially in the States, where they now think Jesus is too liberal, too woke.
Well, the problem is they don't
that's a sign.
think, Mark. That's the problem, and they've got very little understanding of where their faith comes from anyway.
Yeah, but unfortunately, when you get a kind of, and I think it is a pandemic now, when you get a majority of people who say that and yet they profess to be Christian, we know they're churchians. There's a real difference between churchianity and Christianity. When that happens, but they believe, when you've warped a church and the message like that, you're well on the way to bad places. And that's already happened. That's already cast.
Yeah. But charisma and charismatic leaders will only take you so far, right? They will only take you so far. And so...
Well, this is my fear. It's not. I don't think it's going to happen under Trump. Whether he gets to the end, God's will, that will be decided. I mean, there's so many death threats against him already. And it's the people who, once he's no longer of use to them, that they'll get somebody else. And that's, I think, who we should fear.
There is nothing to fear, Mark, but fear itself.
But fear itself.
Nothing to fear but fear itself. But if I may just close on Robert's book here and on his final paragraph about Adolf Hitler, because when I was reading it, I thought, this actually sums this twat up perfectly, if I'm to be quite honest. He says this: despite charismas being something that people are able to manufacture, as with Hitler, we also know genuinely charismatic people in our own lives. Teachers who inspired us, bosses who led us, truly remarkable people whom we would trust with our lives. Thank God such people do exist, because sometimes society depends upon them. Yet for all the huge effect Hitler had on the 20th century and for all the work put into trying to make him appear charismatic, Adolf Hitler was not such a person. His charisma was artificial, and his personality that of a banal, soulless little weirdo with a lot of theories that today wouldn't have stood up to scrutiny in a single serious half-hour radio or television interview. The deaths of 7 million Germans, 34 million Allies, 6 million Jews, and so many others stemmed from the perverse ideas of one of life's utter mediocrities. The pity of it all is beyond description and explanation. And I think that's enough that we need to say about that little weirdo.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's hope it's not a similar refrain 4 years from now.
Let's hope not. Very good.
Ta-ta for now.
See you later, mate. Bye.